The table is 180 feet long, and every inch of it catches light. This is the state dining room at Windsor Castle, November of 1885, and the footmen have been dressing this table since 4 in the afternoon. Candelabra of solid silver gilt march down its center in a slow gold procession, each one holding a dozen wax candles, and below them runs a service of gold plate so old that some of it was cast for a different monarch entirely, kept polished and brought out only for nights like this one. Hothouse orchids sit in low arrangements, so the guests can see one another across the table, forced into bloom in a heated glasshouse 3 months out of their season, because a Windsor dinner in November cannot be expected to make do with whatever England's actual autumn has to offer. The linen has been pressed so precisely that its folds look less like fabric than architecture. Many cards sit at each place, printed in French, listing courses that will arrive one after another in a rhythm that has been rehearsed for hours. Queen Victoria will come in through the side door in a few minutes, small and dark-clothed among the uniforms and diamonds, and take her place at the center of it all, and the room will fall into the particular hush that money and rank produce in a crowd. Diplomats in decorations, officers in scarlet, ladies in silk that took a dressmaker's workroom weeks to finish. Somewhere below the murmur of conversation, an orchestra plays quietly enough that it never has to compete with the guests, only accompany them. Every surface in the room, the candlelight, the gold, the orchids, the linen, has been arranged to produce a single impression, which is that this dinner has simply happened, that its perfection required no visible effort at all, that it exists. Beneath all of that, 3 floors down, and at the far end of a long stone passage, the guests will never walk. Something considerably less inevitable is happening. It is happening in heat that would stagger most of the people upstairs. Within minutes, in air thick with coal smoke and the smell of rendered fat among cast iron ranges that have been burning since before dawn. It is happening under a French chef who is currently losing his composure over a sauce and around a hierarchy of cooks and maids and boys who have not stopped moving in 6 hours and will not stop for 6 more. It is happening near copper pans whose green-black interiors carry a poison nobody in that dining room would recognize by name, and near a larder that was visited overnight by something with a tail. The dinner upstairs and the dinner's construction downstairs are, technically, the same event. They do not otherwise resemble each other in any way at all. This is 1885, and Windsor Castle, along with Buckingham Palace and every great house in England grand enough to entertain on this scale, has agreed to a particular kind of silence. The silence is about where food comes from once it leaves the ground and before it reaches a plate. Nobody at that gleaming table will ask what the kitchen actually looked like tonight, and if they did, the honest answer would embarrass the entire institution of royal dining. This video is that honest answer. Not the version in the household accounts, which record menus and wine and the cost of orchids in December. The version that the scullery maids, the spit boys, and the undercooks live through, night after night, 3 floors beneath the candlelight, so that a queen could sit down to a meal that appeared to require nothing more than good taste and a full larder. We are going to go down those stairs. We are going to look at the ranges that turned a windowless basement into something closer to a furnace room, at the rats and the roaches that got into the stores overnight, at the copper cookware slowly poisoning the food it was meant to prepare, and at the small army of exhausted, soot-stained people whose labor the entire performance depended on and was never meant to reveal. Before we go further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, If you would rather sit with the real version of the past than the polished one, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us keep making this kind of thing. And if you are enjoying this, leave a comment telling me which era or which royal household you would most like to see taken apart this way. I read everyone. Let us begin where every Windsor evening like this one actually began. Not in the dining room. In the kitchen, hours earlier, with a girl named Ellen Sharp standing in front of a range so hot it had already reddened the skin on both her forearms, and a full night of work still ahead of her. Ellen is 19 years old in the autumn of 1885, and she has been a kitchen maid in the royal household for just over 2 years, first at Buckingham Palace, and now, for the winter season, at Windsor. She arrived from a farming family in Berkshire with a letter of character from the local vicar's wife and hands already toughened by years of dairy work, which the palace considered a point in her favor, since a girl who had never done hard labor rarely lasted a month in a royal kitchen. She stands, perhaps 5 feet and 2 inches, sturdily built, with forearms that have thickened with muscle in a way no lady in the dining room upstairs would ever be permitted to display, and a face that is by evening always faintly grey with the coal dust that hangs in the kitchen air no matter how often the flues are swept. She's not one of the 70 or so hire servants who might be glimpsed by a guest in a corridor. She belongs to the world below stairs entirely, and on a night like this, one she will not go above the ground floor at any point, not even to see the room her labour is feeding. Her official position, kitchen maid, sits partway up a kitchen hierarchy that is almost military in its rigidity. A structure common to every great house of the era, but drawn with particular sharpness in a royal household. Below Ellen are the scullery maids, who scour pans and haul water and stand lowest of all in status. Above her are the senior kitchen maids, and above them the yeomen of the kitchen, and above all of them the chef himself, a position that, in great English houses through the middle and later decades of the century, was as a matter of prestige and practice almost always filled by a Frenchman trained in the classical tradition of Antonin Carême, whose most famous English pupil, Charles Elmé Francatelli, had run Victoria's kitchens decades earlier with 2 deputy cooks and 24 subordinates under him. The men at the top of that structure earn wages and respect that Ellen, doing arguably harder physical labor, will never approach. What almost nobody above stairs considers, and what Ellen herself would likely be too tired to articulate even if asked, is what 2 years of this work has already done to her body. Her hands are chapped and in patches, permanently roughened from scalding water and lye soap. She has a persistent cough that thickens every winter, which she attributes correctly to the coal smoke she breathes for 12 and often 14 hours a day in a kitchen with almost no windows. She has a private habit, one she has never told the other maids about, of pressing her wrists against the stone of the larder wall on her rare breaks, because the larder is the only room in the entire service wing that stays cool, and the relief of it against her heat-swollen skin is, some nights, the single most pleasant sensation she experiences between waking and sleep. Tonight, there will be no time for even that. The Queen is entertaining 14 courses worth of foreign guests. The chef has already sent back 1 sauce and shouted at a kitchen boy hard enough to make him cry. And Ellen has just been told that the aspic for the 2nd course, to every person seated above, entirely effortless. What is expected of Ellen on a night like this has almost nothing to do with cooking in any creative sense. She does not compose dishes. She executes instructions with total precision under a chef who considers a badly trimmed vegetable a personal insult while wearing a uniform that must stay presentable enough to pass inspection even as she works 6 feet from an open coal fire. She rises at 5:30 most mornings and will not lie down again until well past midnight on a banquet night such as this one. And in between, she will carry, scour, chop, stir, and run up and down stone stairs so many times that she has stopped counting the flights. She earns, in a year, roughly what one of the diplomats upstairs might spend on a single evening's wine. And critically, nobody in that dining room, from the Queen down to the youngest attaché, is thinking about her at all. That is not cruelty, exactly. It is simply how the system was built to work. The performance above depends entirely on the invisibility of everything below it, and Ellen has understood this since her first week in service, the way a person understands weather. She does not resent it particularly, or at least she has not yet had the leisure to examine whether she does. What she feels most nights is simpler than resentment. She feels tired in a way that settles into the joints and does not fully lift with sleep, and she feels, more than anything else, the heat, which by 9 o'clock on a night like tonight will have turned the kitchen into something closer to the inside of an oven than a room where 19 human beings are expected to think clearly and work with their hands. That heat, and what it does to a body over the course of a single royal dinner, is where this story actually needs to begin. If you picture a Victorian kitchen at all, you probably picture something out of an illustrated Christmas annual. A white hearth, copper pots hanging in orderly rows, a goose turning on a spit, ruddy-faced cooks laughing over the business of a feast. It is a cheerful, glowing image, and it is almost entirely wrong for a working royal kitchen in the 1880 seconds, because the single fact that illustration always leaves out is temperature. And temperature is the fact that governed everything else that happened in that room. The great kitchen at Windsor Castle had stood in more or less the same location since the reign of Edward III in the 14th century. Its stone walls and soaring roof truly medieval, which meant that by the time Victoria's household was cooking 14-course dinners inside it. The building itself was already 500 years old and never designed with ventilation in mind at all. Buckingham Palace's kitchens were newer but shared the same basic problem. Set low in the building, partially below ground, lit by artificial gas rather than daylight for most of the working day. Both kitchens, by the 1880 seconds, ran on a bank of enormous cast iron ranges, the descendants of the closed kitchener range patented earlier in the century. Each one a solid iron structure, the length of a small room, with multiple ovens, hot plates, and roasting spits, all fed from the same roaring coal fire. A single great range like this needed to be lit hours before the first dish was even planned and kept burning at a controlled, ferocious heat for the entire working day. Because letting a fire like that go out and relighting it wasted coal, time, and patience the chef did not have. Multiply one range by the number required to feed a royal household on a banquet night, several of them running simultaneously along one wall of a windowless or near windowless room, and the effect was not warm. It was closer to standing inside a kiln. The historian Ruth Goodman, who has spent years actually cooking on reconstructed Victorian ranges as part of her research into ordinary domestic life, has described the ranges as brutally, punishingly hot to work beside for any length of time, hot enough to make the simple act of standing near one for a full shift a genuine physical trial. And the ranges she used for her experiments were domestic-sized, built for a single family's dinner rather than a state banquet for 40 guests. A royal kitchen in full service multiplied that heat many times over, and did so in rooms with poor air circulation, stone floors that trapped and radiated the warmth back upward, and almost no relief once the sun went down outside, because inside the kitchen it made no difference whether it was noon or midnight. The fire did not know the difference, and neither after enough hours, did the people standing in front of it. Coal-fed, all of it, delivered in enormous quantities to service kitchens of this size. And coal brought its own set of problems long before it ever produced useful heat. It had to be broken, carried and fed into the ranges continuously by kitchen boys, and the lowest maids worked that blackened hands and clothing within the first hour of any shift and left a fine layer of coal dust settled over every surface in the room by evening, including the food. Ash had to be raked out. Fires had to be built up or banked, depending on what was cooking and when it needed to be ready. A skill that fell to the most experienced kitchen staff because a fire mismanaged by even 20 minutes could ruin an entire course meant to reach the Queen's table at a precise moment. And every one of those ranges, burning continuously through a full day of preparation and service, produced heat that had nowhere to go, because a kitchen built into a basement or a 500-year-old stone hall was not built with any mechanism for pulling that heat back out again. For Ellen, on a night like the one we began with, the heat is not an abstraction. It is a physical presence she has been standing inside since the ranges were lit before 6 in the morning, and by the time the aspic crisis breaks at 7:30 in the evening, she has been on her feet in that heat for the better part of 14 hours. Her uniform, cotton and wool, despite the temperature, because no lower servant was permitted the impropriety of dressing for comfort, is soaked through at the back and under the arms. Her face is flushed a deep, constant red that has nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with simple thermal stress. She drinks water whenever she can, warm water carried down from a tap 2 floors up because there is none closer, and she has learned, the way every experienced kitchen maid learns, to recognize the particular light-headed, prickling sensation that comes before a girl goes down in a faint near an open fire, because she has seen it happen to others and does not intend to let it happen to her. Burns, meanwhile, are simply a condition of the work, rather than an accident to be reported. Ellen's forearms carry a scattering of small white scars, mostly from spitting fat, and the edges of hot pans grabbed a half-second too soon, each one so ordinary among kitchen staff that nobody remarks on a fresh one unless it is bad enough to need a bandage. The broader picture, which social historians including Judith Flanders have documented across Victorian domestic service generally, is that kitchen and scullery work produced heat exhaustion, fainting, and long-term physical wear at a rate the era simply accepted as the cost of running a great house, royal or otherwise. Flanders's research into servants' working hours found that housemaids in ordinary large households, whose labor was considerably less strenuous than a kitchen maid's, routinely worked 12 or more hours of continuous physical labor a day, more than a contemporary factory worker. And kitchen staff worked longer hours still on any day involving formal entertaining. Nobody kept careful medical statistics on scullery maids the way the era eventually began keeping them on factory hands, so there is no tidy Victorian survey to cite on how many kitchen workers suffered chronic heat-related illness. What exists instead is the consistent testimony from memoirs like that of Gabriel Toomey, who entered Royal Kitchen Service as a young apprentice and later rose to chief cook to the royal household, describing kitchens so hot that senior cooks worked in little more than shirt sleeves despite every rule of decorum. Boys especially, who simply could not sustain the pace of a full banquet service without collapsing at least once in their early months. The layout of the room made the problem worse rather than better. Windsor's great kitchen was built with a soaring roof and a central lantern intended, in its medieval design, to let smoke rise and escape through vents at the top, a solution that had worked reasonably well when the fire below it was a single open hearth roasting whole oxen. By the 1,880 seconds, that same tall roof was doing its best to vent the output of several enclosed iron ranges running at once, plus additional smaller stoves, charcoal braziers used for delicate sauce work, and gas burners installed by Prince Albert. Decades earlier, as a modern improvement that, whatever its benefits, added yet another source of heat to a room already struggling to lose any. The result was a kind of thermal layering, cooler air near the floor, where the scullery maids knelt over their sinks, and a rising column of heat smoke and grease vapor that thickened as it climbed, so that a tall cook working over a high shelf or a roasting spit, Ellen's own hair, pinned tightly under her cap in the morning, is by evening damp enough at the temples to have gone limp, and she has stopped noticing the particular smell that clings to her afterward, a mixture of coal smoke, rendered fat, and her own sweat that no amount of washing fully removes before the next morning's shift begins. She has learned to drink small amounts often rather than large amounts rarely, because too much water taken quickly on a body already overheated brings on cramping, a fact nobody explained to her scientifically, but that every kitchen maid discovers for herself within her first summer of service. Standing near the roasting range in particular is a task junior staff dread and senior staff assign as a small casual cruelty when a girl has displeased them, because the open heat from a turning spit is markedly worse than the closed heat of an oven door kept shut. Ellen has stood there for 2 solid hours already tonight, turning a saddle of mutton at the chef's specific instruction, and her face carries the tight, papery feeling of skin that has been too close to open flame for too long. There is something clarifying about knowing this, about understanding that the 14 courses gliding out of that kitchen at precisely timed intervals were produced not by some frictionless domestic machine, but by human bodies standing for hours inside conditions closer to industrial labor than to anything the word cooking suggests to us now. The definition of a well-run kitchen in 1885 had almost nothing to do with comfort, because comfort was never part of the design. It had to do with whether the ranges stayed hot enough, long enough for the performance above to go off without a single visible flaw. And the smoke and heat pouring off those ranges did not simply vanish once the food was cooked. It filled the room, thickened the air, and settled into the lungs of everyone standing in it, which is where this story has to go next. Picture, for a moment, kitchen smoke the way most depictions of the era show it. A thin curl rising from a chimney against a grey London sky, faintly picturesque, gone the moment it leaves the building. That image belongs outside the house, at a safe and photogenic distance. It has almost nothing to do with what the air actually contained inside a working royal kitchen, where the smoke never really left at all. It simply moved from one part of the room to another, and everyone standing in that room breathed it for the length of their shift. Coal, burned continuously in a bank of ranges for 12 or 14 hours, produces a great deal more than heat. It produces soot, fine particulate matter that drifts through the air and settles on every surface, including exposed food, cutting boards, and the hands and faces of everyone working nearby. It produces sulphurous fumes that catch in the back of the throat, and in a room with charcoal braziers, commonly used alongside the main ranges for delicate sauce work that needed gentler, more controllable heat than an iron range could offer, it produces carbon monoxide, an odorless and invisible gas. Physicians and household writers of the era spoke in terms of foul air, close air, or bad ventilation rather than any specific gas, but they had, by long observation, correctly identified the symptoms that came with it: headache, nausea, a heavy drowsiness that settled over kitchen workers by the middle of a long shift, and in the worst cases, in the smallest and least ventilated rooms, a genuine risk of collapse. Isabella Beeton's Book of Household Management, the standard reference for domestic management across the country by the 1862nd, and still widely consulted 20 years later, specifically urged proper kitchen ventilation as a matter of servants' health, a piece of advice that a great many kitchens, royal ones very much included, were structurally unable to follow because they had been built decades or centuries before anybody thought to design a kitchen around the people working inside it, rather than simply the food coming out of it. Windsor's great kitchen, medieval in its bones, had that soaring roof and central lantern meant to draw smoke upward and away, and it worked to a degree better than a fully enclosed basement kitchen might have. Buckingham Palace's kitchens, set lower in the building and lit largely by gas, had no such advantage, and depended on whatever ventilation shafts and open doors the staff could arrange, which, on a cold November night, with every draught costing precious heat, the Rangers had worked hard to produce. The air in either kitchen, by the middle of a full banquet service, had gone thick and visibly hazy, a fine grey scrim hanging near the ceiling that thickened as the evening wore on, and every person in that room, from the chef down to the youngest scullery boy, breathed it continuously for the entire length of their working day. There is a particular irony buried in this arrangement that the era never seemed to notice about itself. By the 1882nd, London's outdoor air had become enough of a public concern that newspapers wrote regularly about the thick yellow fogs, the notorious pea soupers that settled over the city in winter, and reformers had begun agitating for smoke abatement in factory districts, on the grounds that coal smoke was a genuine hazard to public health. Windsor and Buckingham Palace, as royal residences, took considerable pride in their gardens, their fresh air, their distance from the industrial grime of the capital. Nobody applied that same concern 3 floors down to a room where the smoke was not drifting past on the wind, but concentrated continuously, directly, into the faces of the people paid to stand in it. Outdoor smoke was a matter of public health and civic improvement. Kitchen smoke was simply Tuesday. For Ellen, the smoke is not something she notices as smoke any longer, the way a person stops noticing their own home's particular smell. What she notices instead is the cough, which arrives every winter without fail and settles into her chest for weeks at a time, tight and productive, worse by the end of any week involving heavy roasting or a run of banquet nights back to back. She has heard the same cough in nearly every kitchen maid who has worked more than a year in service, a rough, wet sound that the senior staff refer to, without much sympathy, as the kitchen cough, as though it was simply a uniform they were all issued along with their aprons. On the worst nights, when the charcoal braziers are lit alongside the main ranges for a delicate reduction the chef is fussing over, Ellen has felt a particular heaviness behind her eyes and a slow, creeping fatigue that has nothing to do with how many hours she has already worked. Billing she has never had explained to her and has simply learned to push through, because stepping outside for fresh air, however badly she might need it, is not something a kitchen maid does in the middle of service without being noticed and reprimanded. Tonight, with the aspic failing to set and the chef already in a temper, one of the braziers has been kept burning far longer than usual beside the main range, so that a reduction can be watched constantly, and the smoke it throws off has begun to sting Ellen's eyes badly enough. Tears that have nothing to do with the shouting, though anyone glancing at her quickly might assume otherwise. She wipes her face on her sleeve, which only smears more soot across her cheek, and keeps working, because the aspic will not fix itself, and nobody is coming to relieve her. The broader medical picture, pieced together from physicians' writings and the household manuals of the period, suggests that what Ellen and her fellow kitchen workers were experiencing had a real physiological basis that nobody around them could fully name. Chronic bronchial complaints among cooks and kitchen maids, appear repeatedly in the domestic advice literature of the era as an accepted, almost unremarkable hazard of the profession, alongside eye strain from the smoke and the general debilitation. Living history experiments conducted decades later by researchers reconstructing Victorian kitchen conditions, including work associated with Ruth Goodman's projects on domestic life, have confirmed what the written record only gestures at: that a coal-fired kitchen range operating for a full day in an enclosed space produces measurable smoke and fume concentrations well beyond what a modern kitchen worker would ever be asked to tolerate, and does so continuously rather than in short bursts. It was not that Victorian medicine lacked any concept of occupational lung disease. Physicians had understood, since the surgeon Percival Pott's work on chimney sweeps a century earlier, that a trade built around constant exposure to soot and smoke carried specific, documentable health risks. That understanding, though, had settled onto a handful of visibly dangerous trades, sweeping chimneys, working in coal mines, and had never extended itself downward into the domestic kitchen, a room the culture still preferred to imagine as warm and homely rather than industrial, however much its ranges, its coal consumption. And its smoke actually resembled a small factory floor. Nobody in 1885 was measuring parts per minute illion of anything. What they had instead was the accumulated, unscientific, but entirely real knowledge that kitchen work made people sick in a slow, grinding way that rarely killed anyone outright and rarely got written down anywhere except in the tired, permanent cough of every woman who had spent a few winters standing in front of a royal range. None of this appeared anywhere in the household accounts, which tracked coal deliveries by the ton, and never once tracked what breathing that coal smoke for a decade did to the people paid to burn it. The air upstairs filtered through high windows, and the scent of orchids and candle wax was a different substance entirely from the air 3 floors below, and everybody in that building, upstairs and down, had simply agreed, without ever discussing it, that only one version of that air counted as the atmosphere of Windsor Castle. The version Ellen breathed had no name in polite conversation at all. It was simply the kitchen, the place, the job, the price of the position, and it settled into her lungs the same way it settled onto every pan and platter that eventually made its way gleaming and spotless up the stairs to the room where nobody would ever think to ask what the air down here had actually been like. Now, the hierarchy itself. Because status below stairs was where the performance of the kitchen became most rigid, most visible, and hardest for anyone standing inside it to escape. If you think about Victorian servants at all, probably think of them as a single undifferentiated category. A below-stairs mass distinguished mainly from the family upstairs rather than meaningfully divided among themselves. That picture collapses almost immediately inside a working royal kitchen, where rank was not a vague social impression, but a precise enforced structure closer in its rigidity to a regiment than to a household. Every person in that kitchen knew exactly where they stood relative to everyone else, and the gap between the top of that structure and the bottom of it was enormous in wages, in authority, and in basic human treatment. At the top stood the chef, and in a great English house of any real ambition, royal households absolutely included, that position was, by long custom, almost always filled by a Frenchman. The prestige of French cuisine had been settled in aristocratic English kitchens since at least the early part of the century, when chefs trained in the classical tradition of Antonin Carême began taking positions in the grandest households in the country. Charles-Aimé Francatelli, who had studied directly under Carême in Paris, served as Victoria's chief cook in the early 1842s, commanding a staff of 2 yeomen of the kitchen as his immediate deputies and 24 subordinate cooks under them, a small army answering to a single Frenchman whose word on any matter of food was close to absolute. By the middle of the 1880 seconds, the specific names had changed, but the structure had not. A French head chef still ran the kitchen, still held authority over English staff who could be dismissed at his recommendation, and still earned a salary that dwarfed anything available to the English men and women working under him, an arrangement that produced, as it had for decades, a low, constant undercurrent of resentment that nobody below the rank of yeoman was in any position to voice out loud. Below the chef came the yeoman of the kitchen, senior cooks with real technical authority over specific areas, the roasting, the pastry, the larder. Below them came the kitchen maids, Ellen's own rank, women who executed the instructions of the cooks above them with total precision and very little creative latitude of their own, however skilled they became. Below the kitchen maids came the scullery maids, who scoured pots, hauled coal and water, and stood at the very bottom of the female hierarchy, doing work considered too menial and too dirty for anyone with even slightly more standing, and running alongside all of it, doing much of the heaviest and hottest labor, were the kitchen boys and spit boys, often no more than children of 11 or 12 taken on because their small size let them work close to a roasting fire or squeeze into spaces an adult could not, paid almost nothing, and disciplined when they were disciplined at all, with a severity that would draw immediate outrage if applied to a child anywhere else in the palace. Part of what made the arrangement sting, for the English staff working under it, was language itself. Kitchen French had become the working vocabulary for any serious English kitchen by the middle of the century, borrowed wholesale from the classical tradition Carême and his followers had exported across the Channel, so that an English kitchen maid like Ellen was expected to recognize and respond instantly to instructions delivered partly in a language he had never formally studied. She had picked up enough over 2 years to follow the chef's rapid commands during service, the names of sauces, cuts, and techniques, all arriving in French even when the rest of the sentence was English, but she still occasionally misheard a word under pressure. And a misheard word in the middle of a 14-course service was not the kind of mistake that earned patience. The arrangement was a small, constant reminder, repeated dozens of times a shift, of exactly whose culinary authority the entire kitchen was organized around and whose was not. Discipline throughout this structure ran on fear as much as instruction. A chef who considered a sauce broken, a vegetable badly trimmed, or a dish delivered a minute late might respond with shouting loud enough to be heard through a closed door. And accounts from staff who worked in grand kitchens of the era, including Gabriel Tschumi's later memoir of his own decades in royal service, describe volcanic tempers among senior cooks as an accepted, almost expected feature of the profession, something junior staff simply learned to withstand, rather than something anyone above them thought to prevent. Genuinely serious misconduct, theft, drunkenness, open insolence to a superior could mean instant dismissal without a character reference, a catastrophic outcome for a servant whose entire future employment depended on being able to produce exactly that reference. Lesser failures, a burned sauce, a late course, meant public humiliation in front of the entire kitchen, which in a room already this hot, this loud, and this exhausting, landed with considerably more force than it might have anywhere else. Ellen occupies a peculiar middle position inside this structure, senior enough to give instructions to the scullery maids below her, junior enough that she has spent 2 years absorbing instructions, criticism, and occasional fury from every rank above her without any real right of reply. Tonight, with the aspic failing and 90 minutes on the clock, she knows precisely how this will unfold if it is not fixed. The chef will demand to know whose responsibility the aspic was. The yeoman who assigned the task will name Ellen, whether or not the true fault lies in an oven that ran too hot or gelatin that was under strength to begin with, because blame in this kitchen travels downward with far more ease than credit ever does. She has already begun quietly reworking the mixture, adding more dissolved gelatin and setting it over ice water she sent a scullery maid running for 2 minutes earlier, not because anyone told her to, but because she has learned, in 2 years, standing at the bottom of a structure built to punish failure and rarely acknowledge success, that surviving a night like this one means fixing the problem before anyone above her notices it existed at all. The kitchen boys occupied the harshest end of this system, and the youngest of them had usually arrived in service by way of family poverty, rather than any ambition toward a culinary career. A boy of 11 or 12, taken on as a turnspit or general kitchen hand, earned a wage that amounted, in real terms, to little more than his keep, and was expected to work the same brutal hours as the adults around him, despite a body that had not finished growing. Historians of Victorian service note that such boys were frequently the target of casual cruelty from staff, only slightly senior to them, cuffed round the ear for slowness, sent on pointless errands as punishment, treated as the lowest possible rung of an already unforgiving ladder. Ellen has seen it happen to the current spit boy, a thin child named Tom, who cannot be more than 12, more than once this week alone, and while she has occasionally slipped him a heel of bread when nobody was watching, she has also learned, the way everyone in that kitchen eventually learns, that intervening too visibly on a junior's behalf risks drawing the same treatment down onto herself. This structure, rigid as it was inside a royal household, was not unique to royalty. Isabella Beeton's Book of Household Management laid out an almost identical hierarchy as the standard model for any large English household with aspirations to proper management: cook, kitchen maid, scullery maid, each rank with its defined duties and its defined distance. Jess, D-tier, evidence that what Ellen experienced at Windsor was an intensified high-stakes version of an arrangement understood and reproduced across the country's grandest houses. What made the royal version distinct was simply scale and consequence. A mistake in a country house kitchen might spoil a dinner party. A mistake in Victoria's kitchen risked embarrassing the monarch in front of visiting heads of state, and that added weight pressed down through every level of the hierarchy, landing hardest, as it always did, on the people with the least power to push back against it. The definition of authority below those stairs had nothing to do with kindness or fairness, and everything to do with proximity to the fire and distance from blame. And critically, everybody in that kitchen understood the rules of that arrangement perfectly. Even the youngest spit boy, even Ellen herself, standing over her rescued aspic with ice water dripping down her wrists. Understanding the rules, though, was never the same thing as being protected by them, and nowhere was that gap more literally dangerous than in the pans hanging on the wall above her head. If you picture the copper pans in a grand Victorian kitchen at all, you probably picture them the way antique dealers sell them today, gleaming, ornamental, hung in decorative rows as a symbol of culinary seriousness and old-world craft. A well-stocked copper batterie de cuisine was, in fact, a genuine mark of a serious kitchen in this period, and Windsor's kitchens held an extensive one, pots and pans in every size, prized for how evenly copper conducts heat compared to iron. What that romantic picture leaves out entirely is what those pans were actually doing chemically to the food cooked inside them, and how much that depended on a single thin layer of a completely different metal that nobody in the dining room ever thought about at all. Copper itself is dangerous to cook in directly, and Victorian science, imperfect as it was in many other respects, understood this specific fact reasonably well. When copper comes into prolonged contact with anything acidic, and a great deal of what a royal kitchen prepared, from vinegar-based sauces to fruit preserves to anything involving wine, was acidic, it forms a set of compounds broadly known as verdigris, greenish-blue copper salts that are genuinely toxic if ingested in sufficient quantity, capable of producing severe nausea, vomiting, and in serious cases, far worse. Solution, understood since at least the previous century, and articulated clearly by French chemists including Chevalier, whose warnings on the subject were referenced approvingly by writers on food safety well into the Victorian period, was tinning, coating the interior of every copper vessel with a thin layer of pure tin, a metal that did not react with food acids the way copper did, and that formed a protective barrier between the pot and whatever was cooking inside it. The problem was that tin linings wore away. Every scrub, every metal spoon or whisk dragged across the surface. Every high-heat cooking session thinned that lining a little further, and eventually it wore through in patches, exposing the raw copper underneath, directly to whatever was being cooked. A well-run kitchen was supposed to send its copper out for retinning regularly, a specialist trade that involved melting fresh tin into the vessel's interior, and a household with the resources of Windsor Castle could, in theory, afford to keep its entire collection properly maintained. In practice, with dozens or hundreds of pieces in constant daily use, retinning a copper batterie de cuisine on a strict schedule was an enormous, continuous logistical task, and the telltale sign that a piece needed attention, a patch of dark, flaky discoloration, or a streak of blue-green residue, was something kitchen staff were expected to catch by eye in a room lit mostly by firelight and gas, in the middle of a service moving too fast for careful inspection of every single pan. This was not a metaphor, and it was not exaggeration. The actual chemical process of verdigris formation was happening quietly, inside pans used every single day to prepare food destined for the Queen's table and for the tables of visiting heads of state, and the margin between a properly tinned pan and a dangerously worn one came down, most days, to whether an exhausted kitchen maid, glancing at a pan's interior in poor light, happened to notice a small green-black patch before she poured in the wine reduction or the fruit compote that would sit in contact with it for the next 20 minutes. Cleaning the copper itself introduced its own strange irony into the routine. To keep the exterior of these pans gleaming for the rare occasions guests or the Queen herself might actually glimpse them, kitchen staff scrubbed them with mixtures built around exactly the kind of mild acids that reacted most readily with exposed copper: vinegar, salt, sometimes tamarind or lemon, rubbed vigorously across the surface until it shone. The polishing that made the palace's copper look most impressive to an outside eye was, chemically speaking, the same category of substance that produced verdigris in the first place, applied by hand, at close range, by kitchen maids whose skin came into direct and repeated contact with it. Nobody understood this as a meaningful exposure at the time. It was simply Tuesday's polishing, a task assigned without any particular caution attached to it, done with bare hands because gloves would have made the fine detail work impossible. Ellen has been trained, the way every kitchen maid was trained, to check a pan's lining before use, running a thumb quickly across the interior surface and looking for the telltale discoloration. And she has, on more than one occasion, pulled a pan from the rotation herself because she did not like the look of it, an act of quiet, done rewarded diligence that nobody above her would ever think to thank her for, since preventing a disaster earns considerably less notice than causing one. Tonight, in the rush of the aspic crisis, she reaches automatically for a copper bowl to set over the ice water. And even mid-crisis, some trained, half-conscious part of her attention runs across its interior, out of pure habit, checking for green before her hands fully register what they are doing. It is not caution, born of any scientific understanding of copper acetate. It is caution born of 2 years of being told, vaguely but firmly, that a discolored pan is a bad pan, and of having seen, once, a scullery maid scolded badly for using one anyway. There is also a quieter difficulty buried inside this hazard, one that made it almost impossible for anyone in Ellen's position to connect cause and effect, even when something did go wrong. Mild copper exposure produces symptoms, stomach upset, headache, a lingering nausea that overlap almost completely with the general exhaustion, heat sickness, and smoke-related malaise that every kitchen worker already lived with as a baseline condition of the job. A kitchen maid who felt unwell after a long shift had a dozen equally plausible explanations available to her before she would ever have reason to suspect the pan she had used that afternoon, and nobody was keeping the kind of careful records that might have let anyone notice a pattern across cases. The danger, in other words, hid extremely well, not because it was rare, but because its effects were nearly indistinguishable from everything else already making these workers tired and sick. The wider food culture of the period made this single hazard considerably harder to guard against, because copper was not only a risk inside the kitchen's own cookware, it was also, disturbingly, sometimes added to food deliberately. The chemist Frederick Occum had exposed, decades earlier, in his widely read treatise on food adulteration, that certain green pickles sold commercially owed their vivid, appetizing color not to fresh vegetables but to copper salts, added specifically to intensify the green. A practice that persisted in various forms for years after his exposure, because the resulting product simply looked more appealing on a grocer's shelf. Arthur Hill Hassel's exhaustive microscopic surveys of London foodstuffs in the early 1852, published in The Lancet, and eventually leading to the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, documented an entire landscape of foods colored, thickened, or bulked out with substances that ranged from merely dishonest to seriously dangerous. Lead-based pigments among cheeses, alum in bread, and copper compounds turning ordinary pickles, a shade of green nature itself rarely produced. A royal kitchen, sourcing from reputable suppliers and staffed by professionals who prided themselves on quality, was in a far better position than most households to avoid the worst of this. But the underlying chemistry of copper's danger to the human body did not become any less real simply because the household in question was wealthy enough to be careful. What this reveals, taken together, is a kitchen operating under a food safety logic that looked, on the surface, reasonably sensible and was, in the specific case of copper, only partially connected to the actual chemical hazard involved. Victorian kitchen staff were taught to watch for visible spoilage, off-smells, discoloration in food itself, signs that a trained eye and a functioning nose could reliably catch. They were considerably less equipped to reason about a slow chemical reaction happening invisibly on the interior surface of their own cookware, a hazard that required specialized knowledge nobody had thought to give a kitchen maid, no matter how careful or how experienced she became. And critically, the beautiful, gleaming copper hanging along the walls of that kitchen, admired by anyone who ever glimpsed it, carried inside every single piece the exact same quiet possibility of harm, waiting on nothing more dramatic than a worn patch of tin and a rushed evening when nobody had time to check. Which brings us to the question nobody in that dining room ever thought to ask, but every larder, made at Windsor and Buckingham Palace, was quietly managing every single morning of the year. What exactly was waiting for them when they opened the larder door? If you imagine the food stores of a royal household, you probably imagine abundance and order. Shelves of preserves labeled in careful copperplate, sides of meat hanging in a cool, controlled space. A system as disciplined as the dining room it eventually served. Wealth and scale did buy the household real advantages here, Windsor and Buckingham Palace could afford better suppliers, more frequent deliveries, and larger, more carefully organized storage than an ordinary household could ever manage. What that wealth could not buy in the England of 1885 was a building free of the two things every food store in the country contended with, regardless of who owned it: vermin and the limits of what Victorian food safety actually understood. Buckingham Palace, in particular, carried a specific and well-documented problem inherited from its earliest years under Victoria. According to the food historian Annie Gray, whose research into the palace kitchens during Victoria's reign forms the basis for much of what is known about conditions there, the palace kitchen in the early decades of the reign had been built directly over an old sewer line, with raw sewage at times seeping up through the floor and gathering near the walls where the cooks themselves stood working. Repairs and improvements over the following decades addressed the worst of this, but the underlying problem, an aging building never designed with modern sanitation in mind, playing host of food preparation on an industrial scale, did not simply disappear because a few pipes had been patched. Windsor's Great Kitchen, 500 years old and built long before anyone had given serious thought to pest-proofing a food store, had its own version of the same structural problem: ancient stonework full of gaps, cracks, and hollow spaces that no amount of Victorian housekeeping could fully seal. Into those gaps came rats, and into the flour bins, dry stores, and anywhere sugar or grain might be left, even briefly uncovered, came what the era universally called black beetles, a term that covered the large cockroaches endemic to old London and Windsor buildings alike. The social historian Judith Flanders, cataloguing conditions in Victorian kitchens and sculleries generally, describes these insects as capable of gathering in genuinely enormous numbers, clustering in corners of kitchen ceilings in what she describes as huge bunches or swarms. To a detail drawn from period accounts of ordinary households, considerably less grand than a royal palace. A kitchen, size of Windsor's, running continuously, generating food waste and warmth in exactly the quantities that vermin found most attractive, had every structural reason to host populations at least as large as anything found in a well-off London townhouse. Vermin were only half of what came through that larder door. The other half arrived already inside the ingredients themselves, delivered by outside suppliers whose products the kitchen staff had every reason to trust and only limited ability to verify. Arthur Hill Hassel's microscopic surveys of London food in the early 1852, the ones that eventually forced Parliament's hand and produced the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, had found chalk mixed into milk to stretch its volume, alum worked into bread to make it whiter and heavier than honest flour alone would allow, and a whole catalogue of colouring agents, some of them actually toxic, added to make ordinary foods look fresher or richer than they actually were. A royal household, buying from established, reputable tradesmen and paying premium prices, stood a considerably better chance of avoiding the worst of this than a poor family shopping at a corner grocer. Better chance was not the same thing as immunity, and no kitchen maid unpacking a delivery of pickled vegetables or a wheel of cheese had any real means of testing, by eye or by taste, whether the vivid color in front of her came from nature or from a chemist supplier further up the trade. The nightly routine this produced was consistent and largely unremarked upon in any official record because it was simply too ordinary to mention. Stores had to be checked each morning for signs of overnight visitors, gnawed sacking droppings, the telltale scattering of grain where something had fed during the night. Traps were set as a matter of course rather than emergency, and a formal rat catcher was, in many great houses of the period, a recognized if unglamorous position. Someone whose entire job was managing a population that never fully went away no matter how many were caught. None of this appeared in the menus sent up to the household accounts, which recorded the elegant final dish and never the condition of the raw ingredient the night before it was cooked. For Ellen, the larder is one of the few truly pleasant places in her working day, cool where the kitchen is unbearably hot, and she has always slightly resented that its coolness comes paired with the job nobody wants, which is checking the shelves each morning before the day's cooking properly begins. She has found droppings among the flour more than once, and has learned to sift and discard the top layer without comment, because raising too much fuss about it marks a maid as squeamish, a reputation that follows a girl and makes her seem unsuited for kitchen work generally. The senior kitchen maid who trained her in her first months explained the standard plainly enough, telling her that a good kitchen maid keeps what she finds to herself, unless it is bad enough to spoil the dish outright. Advice Ellen has since passed along almost word for word to the newer scullery maids under her, because it is simply how the knowledge of this particular compromise gets handed down, quietly, from one exhausted woman to the next. Never written anywhere. An inspector or a member of the household above stairs might happen to read it. She has also, on one occasion, she still thinks about more than she would admit, lifted a muslin cloth off a dish of cream left overnight and found a black beetle drowned in it, and simply skimmed the surface and used what remained underneath because the cream was needed for the morning sauce and there was no time to send for more, as she understood perfectly well even at 17 when it happened. This was not considered remarkable enough to report to anyone. The broader food safety logic of the era made this arrangement feel, to everyone involved, considerably more reasonable than it actually was. Victorian kitchen practice relied almost entirely on visible inspection. Does the meat smell wrong? Does the flour show obvious contamination? Is there mold on the surface? A system that could catch severe spoilage reasonably well, but had no mechanism at all for detecting the invisible bacterial contamination, without any visible trace. Germ theory itself was still working its way from the laboratories of Pasteur and Lister into general medical acceptance during these very years, and had barely begun to touch ordinary domestic kitchen practice at all. A kitchen maid, checking a flour bin for Nord sacking, was applying exactly the food safety standard her entire culture had given her. And that standard, reasonable as it felt from the inside, left an enormous amount of genuine risk completely undetected and unaddressed. What sat behind the gleaming final presentation of every dish that left this kitchen, then, was not simply the heat and the smoke and the hierarchy already covered here. It was also a continuous, largely invisible negotiation with a building nobody had ever managed to fully seal against the small, persistent creatures that shared it. Managed each morning by kitchen maids and larder staff whose job was never to eliminate the problem, since nobody in 1885 believed elimination was possible, but simply to catch what they could see and quietly work around what they could not. Now, the banquet itself, because moving 14 courses from that basement kitchen to the Queen's table, while every single one of them was still properly hot, turned out to be its own kind of impossible problem, solved every single night through sheer human effort rather than any clever piece of Victorian engineering. If you imagine a formal royal dinner arriving at the table, you probably imagine a smooth, almost choreographed procession, footmen gliding in with covered dishes at exactly the right moment, each course appearing as though it had simply materialized rather than traveled any real distance to get there. A state dinner at Windsor in this period actually did run to something like 14 separate courses: soup, fish, an entree or two, a joint of meat, game, a sweet course, ivories, and dessert, each one requiring its own timing, its own temperature, and its own precise moment of departure from the kitchen. The number itself was not showmanship for its own sake. It reflected the classical French service style that had shaped elite English dining for decades, in which a meal unfolded gradually across many small, distinct dishes rather than a few large ones, and a kitchen preparing food for royalty. The actual mechanics behind that sequence bore almost no resemblance to gliding. Windsor's kitchen sat a considerable distance from the state dining room, down long stone corridors and up flights of stairs that had never been designed with a hot soup tureen in mind. Food left the range as close to the moment of serving as the kitchen could manage, packed into covered dishes and carried at genuine speed by footmen and kitchen staff working in a tightly timed relay, because a corridor, cold stone in an English castle in November. Some dishes traveled through hot cupboards, heated serving stations positioned partway along the route specifically to keep food at temperature during the transfer. A Victorian solution to a problem that never fully went away, no matter how many hot cupboards a household installed. Timing had to be worked backward from the moment each course was meant to appear at table, with earlier courses started earlier, and later ones held at precise readiness, a level of coordination that depended entirely on the kitchen staff's collective sense of rhythm, rather than any clock they had time to consult mid-service. Mend. Gabriel Ciumi's later memoir of his decades in royal kitchen service describes exactly this kind of controlled chaos during major state occasions, including, memorably, the chaos that followed when an entire coronation banquet's worth of food had to be managed after the ceremony itself was unexpectedly postponed. A logistical nightmare that gives some sense of how tightly wound the ordinary version of this system already ran, even when nothing went wrong. Ellen's part in this relay tonight involves carrying. Once the aspic crisis resolves itself, with roughly 20 minutes to spare, she is pulled into the line of maids and footmen, responsible for getting finished dishes up the service stairs and into the hands of the footmen who will actually enter the dining room. The trays she carries are heavy laden with silver serving dishes whose covers alone weigh more than most objects she handles in an ordinary day, and the stairs are narrow, worn smooth by generations of servants making exactly this same climb, with almost nothing in the way of proper lighting. She has been told more than once about a maid years before her time who slipped on these same stairs carrying a full tray and broke her wrist badly enough to end her service entirely. Story kept alive less out of sympathy than as a standing warning about the cost of a single misstep. Tonight, moving quickly, because the schedule allows no other option, she takes the stairs 2 at a time in a controlled, practiced rush, arms aching under the weight, focused entirely on not becoming the next cautionary story the newer girls are told. Menu planning for an occasion like this began days in advance, and the household clerk of the kitchen worked out, on paper, exactly which dishes could be prepared ahead and held, which needed to be finished at the last possible moment, and which ovens and ranges needed to be free at which hour to make the whole sequence physically possible inside a kitchen that, however large, still had a finite number of ranges and a finite number of hands to work them. Isabella Beeton's household manuals, aimed at a far more modest scale of entertaining than a state banquet, nonetheless stressed exactly this kind of advanced planning as the difference between a dinner that succeeded and one that collapsed into chaos in its final hour, evidence that even ordinary Victorian hostesses understood at a smaller scale. The same logistical tightrope Windsor's kitchen walked every time it hosted foreign royalty. The difference was simply one of scale and consequence. Middle-class dinner party gone wrong embarrassed a household in front of its neighbors. A royal banquet gone wrong embarrassed the nation in front of watching diplomats. And that difference in stakes traveled all the way down to the maid on the stairs with a tray of soup she could not afford to spill. The physical toll of this part of the evening compounds everything that came before it. Ellen has already spent 14 hours standing in heat and smoke by the time the actual service begins, and the banquet serving period, 90 minutes to 2 hours of continuous urgent carrying up and down those same stairs, asks her body for a final, concentrated burst of exactly the kind of strength and endurance that 14 hours of prior labor should have already exhausted. She does it anyway, Because there is no version of this evening in which a kitchen maid simply announces that she is too tired to continue, and because the alternative, a course arriving late or lukewarm at the Queen's table, carries consequences for the entire kitchen that dwarf whatever private exhaustion any individual maid might be managing. What made this arrangement bearable, if bearable is even the right word, was the same feature that made every other part of this system function: an almost complete invisibility between cores. The guests upstairs, admiring how effortlessly each course appeared at precisely the moment it was wanted, had no reason to imagine the relay of exhausted bodies, moving at a near run through stone corridors 3 floors below them, arms full of silver. The performance was extraordinary in its polish. The machinery behind it, considerably less so, built entirely from human effort, applied at a pace that would have looked, to anyone actually watching it happen, considerably more like an emergency than a dinner party. There is something worth sitting with in the simple arithmetic of this arrangement. 14 courses, each one requiring its own preparation, its own precise timing, and its own physical transport across a properly difficult architectural distance, produced, at the far end of that chain, roughly 2 hours of unbroken, high-stakes physical labor from people who had already worked a full day before that labor even began. Nobody sitting at that table was asked to consider the arithmetic. It had been solved for them, invisibly, by exactly the kind of people this video keeps returning to, and it would be solved again tomorrow night, and the night after that, for as long as the household kept entertaining on this scale. Until 1844, lighting a single fire at Windsor Castle required the cooperation of 3 separate government departments, none of which took orders from the other 2. It sounds like an invention, the kind of detail a comic writer might exaggerate for effect, but it was simply how the royal household had organized itself for generations. An overlapping tangle of ancient offices, the Lord Steward's Department, the Lord Chamberlain's Department, and others besides, each responsible for a narrow slice of palace life, and none of them accountable to a single person capable of resolving a dispute between them. Prince Albert, arriving as consort and appalled by the inefficiency he found, eventually consolidated authority over the day-to-day running of the household into a single new office, the Master of the Household, precisely because the old system had made even the simplest domestic task an exercise in bureaucratic negotiation. By 1885, 4 decades into that reform, its logic still governed how the kitchen was watched, judged, and disciplined, layered underneath the day-to-day authority of the chef himself. If you imagine a royal kitchen's chain of command, you probably imagine something reasonably simple: a chef at the top, giving orders that flowed downward without much friction. The actual structure sitting above that chef was considerably more tangled. The Board of Green Cloth, an ancient administrative body dating back centuries, formally oversaw the provisioning and financial management of the royal household, its members drawn from the Lord Steward's senior officers, and beneath it sat the clerk of the kitchen, a position responsible for tracking every ingredient that entered the building and every dish that left the kitchen. On paper, in numbers, as a matter of institutional accountability rather than culinary judgment, the master of the household since Albert's reform held overall responsibility for making sure the domestic machinery of the palace actually functioned, which meant that any failure serious enough to embarrass the crown could, in theory, travel all the way up that chain, past the chef, past the yeoman, and land as a mark against the entire kitchen's competence in the eyes of an official who might never have set foot near an open range in his life. What this produced in practice was a kitchen operating under 2 simultaneous forms of pressure. The immediate, physical pressure came from the chef, shouting over a broken sauce or a late course in the heat of actual service. The second Quieter pressure came from knowing that any dish carrying a genuine flaw, an off flavor, a badly set aspic, anything that might visibly embarrass the household in front of a foreign dignitary, existed inside a system of records and reports that made true anonymity impossible. Somebody would eventually be identified as responsible. The clerk of the kitchen's careful accounting, meant originally to prevent theft and waste, functioned equally well as a mechanism for assigning blame after the fact. And every kitchen maid understood, even without being told explicitly, that a serious mistake did not simply vanish once the meal was over. It became a fact on record, attached to a name, available to be recalled the next time that name came up for consideration. The stakes of a truly serious blunder went beyond ordinary domestic embarrassment. A state banquet existed to project the wealth, taste, and competence of the British Crown to precisely the foreign visitors whose goodwill the government most wanted to cultivate. A dish that arrived, spoiled, undercooked, or visibly wrong in front of a visiting head of state was not simply bad service. It reflected, in the diplomatic logic of the era, on the nation itself, and the household staff understood that this abstract, national-scale embarrassment could descend onto a specific, identifiable person, with real consequences attached. Permanently damaged reputation among the small, interconnected world of great house service, where word of a maid's failure traveled fast between households. The punishments themselves, when they came, rarely involved anything as traumatic as a formal hearing before the Board of Green Cloth. Most discipline was handled quietly at the level of the chef or the senior yeoman, and took forms that left no paper trail at all: a docked portion of wages for a wasted ingredient, an extra week assigned to the worst scullery duties as an unspoken penance, a public dressing down delivered in front of the entire kitchen staff precisely because humiliation cost the household nothing and served as a warning to everyone else standing within earshot. The most serious failures bypassed the kitchen's internal discipline altogether and went straight to dismissal, a decision that technically required the master of the household's approval, but that, in the crush of daily palace business, was more often simply reported upward after the fact. The chef's word treated as sufficient evidence that a servant's usefulness had ended. Ellen feels the weight of this system most acutely in the moment the chef finally inspects her rescued aspic, roughly 10 minutes before it needs to leave the kitchen. He runs a spoon across its surface, watches how it holds, and says nothing, which in this kitchen counts as something close to praise. She allows herself exactly one breath of relief before moving on to the next task, because there is no time in this schedule for anything longer than a single breath, and because she has learned that a night without visible disaster is simply the baseline expectation, never an occasion for anyone above her to acknowledge what it actually cost her to meet it. She has seen other maids dismissed for far smaller failures than a nearly ruined aspic, and she understands, in the specific, unspoken way that 2 years of service teaches a person that her recovery tonight will never appear in any account of the evening, while a failure would have followed her for the rest of her working life. The broader picture here connects to something documented across Victorian domestic service generally, which is the near-total power an employer held over a servant's future through the mechanism of the character reference. Judith Flanders and other historians of the period have described how completely a servant's employability depended on a good word from a previous employer, a system that gave household staff at every level enormous incentive to avoid even minor blame and very little protection. A royal household, with its layered bureaucracy of clerks, boards, and masters, all theoretically capable of noting a failure, intensified an already unforgiving system considerably, adding institutional memory to a structure that already ran overwhelmingly on fear of consequence rather than any promise of reward for good work quietly done. What sits underneath every one of those 14 flawless courses then? is not simply heat, smoke, and physical exhaustion, though those were real enough on their own. It is also the constant low-grade psychological weight of knowing that an entire administrative apparatus exists above the kitchen, specifically to notice when something goes wrong, with almost nothing built into that same apparatus to notice or reward. The far more common nights when everything quietly went right because of the skill and effort of people nobody upstairs would ever think to ask about by name. The smell alone would tell you something was different if you were somehow able to stand in both places within the same few minutes. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine what a Victorian kitchen is supposed to smell like: roasting meat, fresh bread, perhaps the sweetness of a pudding steaming on the stove, a kind of warm, appetizing blend that period illustrations. That smell existed in this kitchen too, somewhere underneath everything else. It was not, by any measure, the dominant note. The actual atmosphere of a working royal kitchen in full service was considerably more layered and considerably less appetizing than the nostalgic version suggests. Coal smoke supplied a sharp, sulphurous undertone that never fully cleared from the air, mixing with the heavier, greasier smell of rendered animal fat from the roasting ranges, a smell that clung to fabric and hair with a persistence. Underneath that sat the damp, mineral smell of old stone kept perpetually humid by boiling water and steam, particularly strong near the sculleries, where washing up never stopped for more than a few minutes at a stretch. The larder added its own contributions: raw meat and fish waiting their turn, vegetables fresh from the ground, still carrying traces of soil, and, on the nights nobody wanted to think about too closely, the faint, unmistakable smell of a rodent trap that had done its job sometime in the last few hours. And, running through all of it, inseparable from every other odor in the room, was the smell of the people themselves. 19 or 20 human bodies working at hard physical labor, in intense heat, for 12 or more hours, sweat that had no opportunity to be washed away mid-shift. Sweat that mixed with coal dust to leave a particular grey-black residue in the creases of skin and the folds of clothing that stayed until the next proper wash day, sometimes several days off. Household staff were not entirely without weapons against this atmosphere, though none of them addressed the underlying cause. Isabella Beeton's household manuals recommended vinegar washes for kitchen surfaces and the burning of small amounts of charcoal or aromatic herbs to freshen the air in food preparation areas. Advice followed, where time allowed, in kitchens across the country, including Windsor's own. These were surface treatments applied to a problem that was structural rather than superficial, and any kitchen maid could have told you, if anyone had thought to ask her, that a vinegar rinse on the stone floor did very little to counteract 12 continuous hours of coal smoke and rendered fat rising off a bank of roaring ranges. The smell was not dirt that could be scrubbed away. It was the direct, unavoidable byproduct of the work itself, regenerated fresh every single day the ranges were lit, which in a royal household meant every day without exception. None of this traveled upstairs in any recognizable form. By the time footmen carried each covered dish through the long corridors and hot cupboards separating kitchen from dining room, whatever smell clung to the food itself had been contained, masked, or simply outpaced by the room it was entering, a dining hall perfumed by hothouse flowers, beeswax candles, and the particular clean scent of expensive fabric that had never once been worn by anyone doing physical labor. The two atmospheres, one floor apart by distance and an entire world apart by experience, shared no common odor whatsoever, and the guests seated at that gleaming table had absolutely no sensory evidence, because every mechanism of the building's design existed specifically to prevent that evidence from ever reaching them. Ellen carries the kitchen smell with her constantly, in a way she stopped consciously noticing sometime in her first few months of service, the way anyone stops noticing a smell that never leaves. Other servants, the ones working above stairs in the household's more visible ranks, the housemaids and the ladies' maids who occasionally cross paths with kitchen staff in a back corridor, can apparently still smell it on her, a fact she knows because she has seen a small involuntary wrinkle of a nose when a housemaid passes close enough to catch it. She does not resent this exactly, because she can smell the same thing on every other kitchen maid, and has simply come to think of it as belonging to her position, the way a uniform belongs to it, something she puts on with the job rather than something wrong with her personally. On the rare occasion she steps outside briefly, sent to fetch something from an outbuilding on a cold, clear night, the shock of ordinary outdoor air, damp grass and distant wood smoke, rather than the concentrated, layered smell of the kitchen, is sharp enough that she sometimes stands still for a moment longer than the errand requires, simply breathing it in before she has to go back down. This separation was not accidental. The architectural historian Marc Girard, in his extensive research into the design of English country houses, has documented how deliberately grand households of this era built entire secondary systems of staircases, corridors, and service passages specifically, so that servants could move through the building, performing their duties without ever being seen or smelled by the family and its guests. Windsor and Buckingham Palace, older and grander than any country house Girard studied, but built around exactly the same social logic, took this principle further than most, burying the kitchen itself several floors. The distance was never simply about temperature or noise. It was about making sure that two very different physical realities, one of ease and one of hard labor, never had to occupy the same sensory space at the same time. The broader history of smell and class in this period supports exactly this kind of division. Historians studying Victorian sensory experience, including researchers building on Judith Flanders's work on domestic life, have noted how thoroughly Victorian elite culture organized itself around the control and concealment of smell, perfume, flowers, and elaborate ventilation schemes, all deployed specifically to keep the polite world's air free of anything that might suggest bodies working hard nearby. A servant's smell, particularly a kitchen servant's smell, functioned in this period as a kind of unspoken class marker, immediately identifiable and impossible to fully disguise no matter how carefully a maid scrubbed herself before any rare occasion she might be glimpsed by the family upstairs. The household's entire architecture, its long corridors, its separate staircases, its considerable physical distance between kitchen and dining room, existed in part to manage exactly this problem, keeping two entirely different sensory worlds from ever overlapping in a room where a guest might actually notice. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that smell, of all things, drew such a precise and unbridgeable line between two groups of people working inside the exact same building on the exact same evening. The Queen's dining room and Ellen's kitchen shared walls, shared a roof, shared eventually the very same food. They did not share a single breath of air in common, and every person in that building, upstairs and down, had grown up entirely used to that fact, the way a person grows used to any arrangement that has simply always been true. If the kitchen smell was one kind of mark left on every person who worked there, the toll the work took on their bodies over years was a far deeper and far less visible kind of mark, one that rarely showed up in any record anyone thought worth keeping. It is tempting to imagine that a young, sturdy kitchen maid like Ellen simply worked her years in service and moved on unchanged, the way a modern audience might picture any first job, demanding but ultimately survivable, a chapter that closes cleanly once a person moves to whatever comes next. The actual physical arithmetic of a career spent in a Victorian working kitchen tells a considerably harder story. Years of standing on stone floors near open ranges produced chronic joint and back problems that showed up early, often before a servant reached 30, the kind of pain that had no real treatment available beyond simply working through it. Because a kitchen maid, who could no longer stand for 12 hours at a stretch, had no place left in that hierarchy at all. The chronic cough that settled into Ellen's chest every winter, the one the senior staff shrugged off as an unremarkable feature of the job, was, across a full working life, a genuine risk factor for the kind of lasting bronchial damage that Victorian physicians documented without much precision among cooks and kitchen workers generally. Hearing, too, took a quiet toll in the loudest kitchens, worn down over years by shouted orders, clattering copper, and the constant roar of the ranges themselves. A form of damage nobody in this period had any real name for, let alone any way to prevent. What almost never happened for a kitchen maid at Ellen's rank was anything resembling a pension, a formal retirement, or an institutional acknowledgement that years of hard service deserved some measure of security once a body could no longer keep pace. A small number of exceptional cooks, men mostly, rose far enough in the hierarchy to build careers that lasted decades and carried real security with them. Gabriel Tschumi himself, whose later memoir provides so much of what is actually known about the interior life of these kitchens, is the rare example of a career that began in apprenticeship and ended many years later as chief cook to a queen, a trajectory available to vanishingly few of the people who worked alongside him at any given moment. For the great majority of kitchen maids and scullery maids, women who made up the bulk of the kitchen's daily labor, no such path existed. Women like Ellen could reasonably expect to work in service for perhaps a decade or so, until marriage, injury, exhaustion, or simply the arrival of a younger, cheaper girl ended her position, at which point she would leave with whatever character reference her service had earned her and largely disappear from any record that historians can now recover. This disappearance is, in its own way, the single most important fact this video has to offer, more important than any individual detail about heat or verdigris or smell. The historical record overwhelmingly preserves the perspective of the people who ate the 14 courses rather than the people who produced them. Menus survive, guest lists survive. The chef's name, when it belonged to someone sufficiently famous, survives in cookbooks and society gossip. The names of the dozens of kitchen maids and scullery maids and spitboys who made a single Windsor banquet physically possible survive only occasionally in scattered household wage books, in the rare memoir like Tschumi's, in census records that list an occupation without a single word about what that occupation actually demanded of the body performing it. Ellen Sharp herself is a composite drawn from exactly this kind of scattered, incomplete evidence, built to stand in honestly for thousands of real women whose individual names the historical record simply never bothered to keep. What the surviving evidence does make clear, taken together, is the sheer scale of labor required to sustain the version of monarchy Victoria's household presented to the world. The royal household as a whole, across its various departments, employed several hundred servants at any given time, a small city of below-stairs labor supporting a public performance of effortless royal grandeur that depended at every single point on people whose names the public performance was never designed to include. The kitchen alone, at a residence the scale of Windsor, required dozens of hands working in close, punishing coordination, and multiplying that arrangement across every great house in England, wealthy enough to entertain on a similar scale, suggests an enormous stot. Largely undocumented workforce, whose collective physical suffering built the entire visible apparatus of Victorian elite hospitality, one banquet at a time. one exhausted body at a time. By 1885, Parliament had already spent decades passing factory acts intended to limit the working hours of women and children in mills and workshops, legislation that reflected a genuine, hard-won recognition that industrial labor performed for too many hours under dangerous conditions. None of those protections reached anywhere near a domestic kitchen, royal or otherwise, because domestic service was legally treated as a private arrangement between employer and servant rather than an industry subject to public oversight, regardless of how closely a working kitchen's actual conditions resembled the factory floor. Those same laws were written to regulate. Ellen worked longer hours in arguably more dangerous conditions than a mill girl protected by an Act of Parliament specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of exhaustion Ellen experienced every single working day. And no lawmaker of the period ever seriously proposed extending that same protection into a kitchen simply because the kitchen happened to sit inside a home rather than a factory. There is also a quieter, more particular cost worth naming here, one that fell specifically and unevenly on the women in that kitchen rather than the men. A male cook who rose through the ranks could reasonably hope for a name, a reputation, sometimes even a published cookbook carrying his own words into history, as both Francatelli and Tschumi eventually managed. The women beneath him, doing comparably hard and in some ways more physically demanding labor, had no equivalent path available at all. Kitchen maids did not become chefs in this period, regardless of skill or years of service, because the entire structure of professional cooking, from apprenticeship to guild-like prestige, was built around and reserved for men. Ellen's ceiling was fixed the day she entered service, not by any lack of ability, but by a system that had already decided, before she ever lit a single range, precisely how far a woman in her position was permitted to rise. Ellen does not know any of this in the abstract terms a historian might use to describe it. What she knows standing in the kitchen doorway sometime past midnight, after the last course has finally gone up and the washing has finally slowed to something manageable, is simply that her feet ache in a way that has become entirely familiar, that her chest feels tight in the particular way it always does by this point in a long service night, and that she has, in fact, survived this particular evening without the disaster that seemed possible 90 minutes before the aspic finally set. She allows herself, for perhaps the only time all day, a moment of something close to satisfaction, not pride exactly, because pride was never really available to someone in her position, but a quiet, private recognition that she did the work in front of her and did it well, whether or not anyone above stairs would ever know her name well enough to credit her for it. There is something worth holding onto in that small, unwitnessed moment, because it is, in its own way, the truest image this video has to offer. Not the gleaming table upstairs, and not even the chaos of the kitchen at its worst. A tired young woman standing quietly in a doorway at midnight, having done something truly difficult and done it well, with no expectation that anyone would ever notice. That, more than any menu card or gold plate, is what actually built the evening Queen Victoria and her guests experienced as effortless. Step back now from the individual details, the ranges and the smoke, the copper and the vermin, the stairs and the shouted instructions, and a smaller number of larger patterns begin to emerge, patterns that connect not just to this one kitchen on this one night, but to the entire structure of how Victorian wealth and Victorian labor were arranged around each other. The first pattern is the simplest to state and the hardest to fully absorb. The performance of effortlessness upstairs required an almost unimaginable quantity of effort downstairs, and the two amounts were directly, precisely proportional to each other. Every additional course added to that 14-course menu meant additional hours of preparation, additional heat endured, additional physical risk taken on by people whose names would never appear on the menu card itself. The gold plate gleamed exactly as brightly as it did because someone had polished it for hours. The aspic set exactly as cleanly as it did because a 19-year-old girl fixed it in a panic with cold water and steady hands while a chef shouted nearby. Nothing about that dinner arrived. Effort was simply relocated, entirely and deliberately, to a floor the guests never visited, and a set of people the guests never thought to ask about. The second pattern concerns safety, and it runs through nearly every chapter of this particular story. Victorian food safety, as practiced in even the most careful and best-resourced kitchen in the country, meant what could be seen, smelled, or tasted, and stopped almost entirely at the edge of what chemistry and biology could actually detect. A kitchen maid checking a copper pan for green discoloration was applying real, useful knowledge, but that knowledge had no way of catching a slow chemical reaction happening under a visually intact tin lining. A larder maid sifting droppings out of flour was managing a genuine visible hazard while remaining completely unequipped to detect the invisible bacterial contamination that same visit might have left behind. This was not carelessness. It was the honest limit of what an entire era's accumulated wisdom had managed to figure out. Applied as diligently as any modern safety inspector applies today's considerably more complete understanding, and failing in exactly the places that understanding had not yet reached. The third pattern concerns memory itself, and it is perhaps the coldest of the four. The historical record of this evening, to the extent any record survives at all, preserves the menu, the guest list, the wine, and perhaps the chef's name, if he happened to be sufficiently famous or sufficiently badly behaved to attract notice. It does not preserve Ellen. It does not preserve the scullery maids, the spit boys, the larder girls, or the dozens of other hands whose labor made the meal physically possible. The hierarchy that organized who did the hardest, most dangerous work in that kitchen is the same hierarchy, precisely mirrored, that determined whose experience survived into the historical record at all. Those with the least power in 1885 left the least trace for anyone in the present to recover. And every effort this video has made to describe Ellen's specific evening has required building outward from scattered fragments, wage books, memoirs like Jumi's, social histories like Flanders's and Gray's, rather than pointing to any single named woman who actually stood at that range on that particular November night. The fourth pattern is in some ways the most hopeful of the group, though hopeful may not be quite the right word for it. Endurance in this kitchen was not a fragile or decorative virtue, the kind of patient suffering a sentimental Victorian painting might assign to a servant in the background of a grander scene. It was a genuine, hard-won physical skill, developed and exercised every single day, indistinguishable in practice from expertise. Ellen fixing that aspic in the space of 90 frantic minutes was not luck. It was competence built from 2 years of paying close attention to exactly how gelatin behaves under stress. Competence that nobody above her would ever formally recognize as competence, because recognizing it would have meant admitting how much of the evening's success actually depended on her rather than on the chef whose name appeared. If any name appeared at all, in whatever record of the dinner survived. The logic behind all of this was practical, in the narrowest and least generous sense of that word. A royal household run this way was cheaper, faster, and more directly under the chef's total control than one that gave its lower servants any meaningful voice, rest, or protection. Nobody sat down and designed cruelty into the system as an end in itself. The cruelty was simply what remained once every decision had been made in favor of efficiency, hierarchy, and the uninterrupted flow of an impressive dinner, with no serious consideration ever given to the physical cost being paid by the people executing that flow. And everybody inside that system, from the Queen down to the youngest spit boy, had grown up entirely accustomed to it, the way anyone grows entirely accustomed to an arrangement that has simply always existed around them. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture considerably. The image most people carry of a Victorian royal banquet, gold plate, candlelight, the Queen presiding serenely over a room full of admiring guests, is not false exactly. It is simply half the picture, the half that was designed from the very beginning to be the only half anyone upstairs would ever see. The other half, the half this video has spent its length describing, was every bit as real, every bit as consequential, and every bit as central to how that evening actually came together, and it has simply never received anything like equal attention in how this era gets remembered. What makes Ellen's evening worth this much attention, in the end, is not that her experience was unusual. It is that her experience was almost perfectly ordinary, repeated with only minor variation in kitchen after kitchen, house after house, night after night, across the entire wealthy stratum of Victorian England for decades on end. She is not a dramatic exception, a historical record simply overlooked by accident. She is the representative case, the pattern itself made visible for a few minutes, rather than left in the permanent shadow the era's own architecture and its own habits of attention consistently placed her in. It is worth pausing too on how thoroughly this arrangement depended on treating a young woman's body as an inexhaustible instrument rather than a thing with limits. Every hazard this story has traced the heat, the smoke, the copper, the weight of a laden tray on a narrow stair, landed with particular force on the women who made up the majority of the kitchen's lowest ranks. Women whose physical endurance was simply assumed as a baseline requirement of the position, rather than treated as the considerable achievement it actually was. A male chef's temperament was indulged, sometimes even admired, as evidence of artistic seriousness. A female kitchen maid's exhaustion was expected, unremarked upon, and quietly replaced with a fresh, younger set of hands the moment it began to show. The same culture, capable of writing sentimental verse about womanly delicacy, staffed its royal kitchens with women it required to labor for 14 unbroken hours beside an open flame, and never once seemed to notice the contradiction sitting between those two ideas. There is also something worth saying about scale, because a single kitchen, no matter how vividly described, can make this story feel smaller and more contained than it actually was. Windsor and Buckingham Palace were simply the most visible examples of an arrangement repeated, with variations of degree rather than kind, across every great country house, every wealthy London townhouse, and every establishment in Britain grand enough to employ a full kitchen staff and ambitious enough to entertain lavishly. The specific gold plate and the specific 14 courses belonged to royalty. The underlying machinery, the heat, the hierarchy, the invisible risk, the women whose names went unrecorded, belonged to the entire class of household this one merely exemplified at its most extreme and most photographed. Multiply Ellen by every kitchen maid in every substantial house in the country across every decade of the 19th century, and the true size of this pattern becomes considerably harder to hold in the mind all at once. There is a final observation worth adding here, one that reaches slightly beyond 1885 itself. The specific technologies have changed considerably since Ellen stood over that range. Gas and electricity replacing coal, refrigeration replacing the larder's uncertain coolness, food safety regulation replacing a kitchen maid's trained eye as the primary defense against contamination. What has changed far less in any commercial kitchen operating under real-time pressure and real hierarchy is the basic shape of the arrangement itself. Skilled, exhausting, physically demanding labor performed largely out of sight by people whose competence is assumed rather than celebrated, so that the people being served can experience the results as something close to magic. Ellen's kitchen was an extreme, intensified version of a pattern that a great many professional kitchens, in one form or another, have never fully abandoned. Upstairs, the dinner is winding toward its close. The savories have gone up and come back down again. The dessert course has been admired and mostly finished, and Queen Victoria has begun the quiet, practiced business of signaling that the evening is drawing to an end. A small shift in posture that the entire room reads instantly and responds to. The ladies withdraw first, in the custom of the era, and the gentlemen linger briefly over their glasses before the whole gathering begins its slow dispersal toward drawing rooms, corridors, and eventually bed, the orchestra's final piece fading into the general murmur of departure. Footmen begin dousing candles in careful sequence, starting from the ends of the room farthest from where guests still stand, and the gold plate that gleamed so brightly 3 hours earlier now sits half cleared, waiting for the last of the company to leave before anyone can properly begin taking it away. 3 floors down, the kitchen has entered a different phase of the same evening, one that will last considerably longer than the meal it was serving. The final courses have gone up, but the work is nowhere near finished. Pots and pans return in a steady stream to the sculleries, where the lowest maids scrub away the accumulated evidence of 14 courses cooked at speed under pressure. Copper and iron and silver all needing to be cleaned, dried, and returned to their places before the kitchen can be considered closed for the night. Whatever food has come back down uneaten, and a formal dinner of this scale always produces some, gets sorted according to a household custom nearly as old as the position of servant itself, with a portion set aside for the servants' hall supper that the lower staff will finally sit down to once the immediate work is done. Informal compensation for hours that have offered almost nothing else in the way of reward. The ranges themselves are banked down rather than fully extinguished, coals raked and covered to hold a low, steady heat through what remains of the night, because relighting them fully from cold in a few hours' time for the household's early breakfast service would cost more coal and more time than simply keeping a modest fire alive until morning. The clerk of the kitchen makes his final rounds before retiring, tallying what has been used against what was ordered. Bureaucratic ritual utterly indifferent to how close the evening came to disaster over one uncooperative aspect, because the paperwork records outcomes rather than the human effort required to produce them. The chef, his temper finally spent along with most of his energy, gives a handful of terse instructions for the morning and disappears toward his own quarters, leaving the yeoman to see the last of the cleaning through to completion. It is well past 1 in the morning by the time anyone tells Ellen she may finally stop. She climbs, slowly now, the same stairs she took 2 at a time earlier in the evening, her legs registering every step in a way they did not have the luxury of noticing during the actual crisis of service. Her shared attic room, 3 flights above the kitchen, and worlds away from it in every sense but the purely physical, is cold and plain. A narrow bed, a washstand, a small mirror. She rarely has reason to consult except from simple habit. She washes her face and hands in water that has gone cold hours ago, watching a faint grey tint lift from her skin and settle into the basin. The accumulated coal dust and grease of a 14-hour shift finally coming away, if only partially. In the small mirror, for just a moment, she looks at her own reflection, flushed still from the heat she stood in for most of the day. Hair damp at the temples, eyes heavy with an exhaustion that goes considerably deeper than one long night could fully explain. she does not linger on the image. There is no time, and if she is honest with herself, not much appetite for it either. Through the small attic window, the sky over Windsor has not yet begun to lighten, but it will before very long. In 4 hours, perhaps 5 if she is fortunate, someone will knock at the door of this room, and Ellen will rise, dress, and go back down those same stairs to help coax this morning's cold banked fire back into a working range, because breakfast for a royal household does not wait for a kitchen maid's exhaustion to pass, any more than dinner did. She lies down without undressing further than necessary, pulls a thin blanket over herself against the attic's chill, and is asleep. By all accounts of how thoroughly this kind of day exhausted a body within a very few minutes. Downstairs, the great table sits empty now, its candles extinguished, its gold plate finally being gathered by the last footman still on duty, the orchids beginning to wilt slightly in the room's cooling air. It is, in this quiet hour, simply a room, handsome and still, with no visible sign remaining of either the glittering performance it hosted a few hours earlier or the exhausting labor that made that performance possible. Both have gone to bed in their separate ways, 3 floors and an entire world apart, and the castle settles into the few hours of genuine quiet it is permitted before the whole elaborate machinery of royal life begins turning again with the dawn. Picture the table again, the one we began with. 180 feet of white linen pressed into folds too precise to look like fabric, candelabra marching down its center in slow gold procession, gold plate old enough to have served a different reign, orchids forced into bloom months out of their proper season simply because a November evening at Windsor was not permitted to look like November. Queen Victoria at the center of it, small and dark among the uniforms and the diamonds, the whole room arranged around the practiced impression that this evening had simply happened, complete, inevitable, requiring nothing more than good taste and a well-stocked larder. You now know what that impression cost to produce. You know that 3 floors below that table, a bank of cast iron ranges burned at a heat closer to a furnace than a kitchen, hot enough that a girl standing near the roasting spit for 2 hours came away with skin drawn tight and papery from proximity to open flame. You know that the smoke those ranges produced filled the room in a slow, thickening haze that settled into the lungs of everyone breathing it, and that Victorian medicine had a name for the resulting cough, but no real remedy beyond simply enduring it, year after year, winter after winter. You know about the hierarchy that organized every person in that kitchen, with something close to military precision, a French chef at the top, earning a salary the English staff under him could not have imagined. And at the very bottom, children of 11 and 12 turning spits for wages that amounted to little more than their keep. You know too about the copper hanging in gleaming rows along the kitchen walls, admired by anyone who glimpsed it, quietly capable of poisoning the food, cooked inside it the moment its thin tin lining wore through. A hazard nobody in that kitchen had the chemistry to fully understand, though they managed it as best their era's knowledge allowed. You know about the larder, cool and welcome after the heat of the range, and about what sometimes waited there overnight. Gnawed sacking, a drowned insect in a dish of cream, the ordinary, unremarked cost of feeding a household from a building never designed to keep vermin out entirely. You know how those 14 courses actually traveled from that basement to this table, not gliding, but carried at a near run up worn stone stairs, by maids whose arms ached under trays heavier than almost anything else they handled in an ordinary day, racing a clock that had no patience for how tired anyone already was. You know about the layers of watching eyes above, even the chef, the board of green cloth, and the master of the household, and the clerk of the kitchen, with his careful ledgers, an entire administrative apparatus built to notice failure, and largely silent on the subject of everything that quietly went right. You know what the kitchen actually smelled like? The coal smoke and rendered fat and old damp stone and the sweat of 19 or 20 bodies working hard in punishing heat, an atmosphere that shared no air whatsoever with the perfumed candle-lit room. And you know finally what years of this work did to the people who performed it. The chronic coughs and aching joints, the near total absence of any path towards security or rest. The simple fact that almost none of their names survived into any record anyone thought to keep. You know, beyond all of that, about the 14 hours already behind Ellen before the actual banquet service even began, the coal broken and carried since before dawn, the ash raked, the fires built and rebuilt, the endless chopping and stirring and carrying that filled every hour between one meal and the next. You know that none of this appeared anywhere in the elegant French wording of the menu cards laid at each guest's place, and that no diplomat seated at that table, admiring the soup or the game or the confection that closed the meal, had the faintest reason to wonder what the previous 14 hours had actually demanded of the people who produced it. This is not a detail most people carry with them when they picture a scene like this one, and knowing it changes the picture considerably. The woman at the center of that table was real, and her evening was exactly as gracious and as gleaming as it appeared. She was also, without ever needing to think about it, standing at the visible summit of an enormous, largely invisible structure of human effort, one she had almost certainly never been asked to examine closely and had no particular reason to question, because it had simply always been arranged this way for her and for every monarch before her. And Ellen, 3 floors below, was not a footnote to that evening. She was one of its actual authors, alongside dozens of others whose names have gone the same way hers has, mostly unrecorded, entirely unrecognized in any account of the dinner that historians would later study. She was not a figure of pure suffering either, and it would be its own kind of dishonesty to leave her that way. She was a 19-year-old woman who had, by that November evening, become truly skilled at a difficult, demanding craft, who knew exactly how gelatin behaves under pressure, and exactly how to read a discolored patch on a copper pan, who fixed a near disaster with steady hands while a chef shouted nearby, and who allowed herself, once the crisis passed, one quiet breath of something close to satisfaction that nobody above her would ever witness or acknowledge. She was not the porcelain figure a sentimental painting might have made of her, decorative and passive in the background of someone else's story. She was a person with real competence, real exhaustion, and a body that had already begun, at 19, to carry the accumulated cost of the life she had been born into. There is something clarifying in holding both of these women in view at the same time. The queen at her table, and the kitchen maid 3 floors under it, without collapsing one into a simple villain and the other into a simple victim. Victoria did not personally design the heat of that kitchen or the wages paid to the girls working in it. She inherited a system built over centuries by people who had never once been required to stand where Ellen stood, and she moved through that system the way anyone moves through the world they are born into, largely without examining its foundations, because examining them was never asked of her and rarely occurred to her. Ellen, for her part, did not experience her own life primarily as an injustice to be catalogued. She experienced it as a job, demanding and exhausting, that she had grown truly skilled at, alongside women she worked beside and occasionally laughed with in the brief pauses between crises. In a world that had given her very few alternatives, and that she navigated with more competence and more quiet dignity than the historical record has ever bothered to credit her for. None of this belonged only to Windsor, or only to that one November evening. The same arrangement, heat and hierarchy and invisible risk, carried by women whose names went unrecorded, played out with only minor variation in country houses and London townhouses across the entire wealthy stratum of England for decade after decade. Every time a Victorian painting shows a grand table, a laden sideboard, a hostess presiding serenely over a room full of admiring guests, the same 3 floors of unseen labor stand somewhere beneath the frame, cropped out by the artist as thoroughly as the household itself cropped it out of the story it told about its own elegance. Once you have seen this pattern clearly in one kitchen, it becomes difficult not to notice its outline standing behind nearly every polished surface the era left behind for us to admire. What the gold plate and the candlelight were never designed to show, and what this evening has tried to show instead, is that the entire performance of effortless royal grandeur rested every single night on precisely this kind of unglamorous, unrecorded human skill, exercised by people who received almost none of the credit and almost all of the physical cost. The dinner upstairs was real. The dinner's true architecture, the one built from coal and copper and aching feet and steady hands working against an impossible clock, was equally real and considerably more difficult to achieve. And it deserves at the very least to be seen clearly, once, for exactly what it was. By now, if you have stayed with this story through its full length, the castle itself has gone quiet, the way it does every night. The last candle in the state dining room extinguished, the gold plate finally carried away, the orchids beginning their slow wilt in a cooling room nobody will enter again until morning. Somewhere above the empty table, Queen Victoria sleeps in whatever peace her particular life afforded her. Somewhere below it, in a narrow attic room, 3 flights above a bank of slowly cooling ranges, Ellen sleeps too. Her hands finally still, after a day that asked nearly everything of them. A few short hours standing between her and the moment someone knocks to wake her for the morning's fires. 2 women, in the same building, on the same night, living such entirely different lives that they might as well have inhabited different centuries, joined only by the single meal that passed, briefly and completely invisibly, between them. Morning will come to Windsor in a few hours, the way it comes every day, regardless of how little rest the previous night actually allowed. A bell will sound somewhere in the servants' wing before the sky has properly lightened. A door will swing in a kitchen passage, and somewhere below the state dining room, banked coals will be raked open and coaxed back toward a working flame, because a royal household eats breakfast whether or not the people preparing it slept enough to face another full day of standing before an open range. Ellen will rise when the knock comes, dress in the cold half-light of her attic room, and go back down those same worn stairs one more time. To begin, in every practical sense, the exact same day again. This was not a single unusual night in an otherwise gentle life. It was simply Tuesday, repeated with only minor variation for as long as her body allowed her to keep doing the work. That is the truth of this particular evening, and of countless evenings like it across the great houses of Victorian England. Not the version painted for the guests, and not a simple story of cruelty either, but the real one, built from heat and skill and endurance, lived out quietly, night after night, by people whose names we will mostly never recover, and who deserve all the same to be remembered as exactly what they were. Skilled, resilient, quietly, thoroughly exhausted, and entirely, unmistakably human. Think, if you find yourself doing so, in the days after watching this, about every gleaming photograph and every gilded portrait you encounter from this era, every grand table, every glittering ballroom, every image the 19th century left behind of itself. Somewhere just outside the frame of nearly all of them, a version of Ellen is standing, or kneeling, or climbing a narrow stair with something heavy in her arms, entirely unrecorded, entirely essential, and entirely unaware that anyone, more than a century later, would ever think to wonder about her specifically. That absence is not an accident of history. It was, in its own quiet way, the whole point of how these rooms were built and how these evenings were designed to be remembered. Seeing past it, just once, all the way down to the coal and the copper and the aching arms that made the gold plate possible, is its own small act of restoring something the record never intended to keep. The castle keeps its old rhythm, regardless of who notices it. Ranges will be lit tomorrow exactly as they were lit today, and the day after that, and for as long as fires cook the food that royalty ate. Somewhere inside that rhythm, quietly, without complaint and without recognition, women very much like Ellen kept doing the actual work that made every gleaming evening possible. One exhausting, skillful, unrecorded day at a time. That is not a sad story, exactly, though it holds sadness inside it. It is simply the true one, and it deserved, after all this time, to finally be told. There is a certain peace available in simply letting both halves of this evening rest together in the mind without needing to resolve them into a tidier lesson than the facts actually support. The candlelight was real and worth its own quiet admiration. The labor underneath it was real too and worth exactly the same close attention this account has tried to give it, not as an accusation leveled backward at people long dead, but as a form of honest company kept with them across the considerable distance of more than a century in the last hour before sleep. History rarely offers anything as simple as a villain and a victim standing at opposite ends of a single table. More often, it offers precisely this: a whole household of people, high and low, doing what their era asked of them, with whatever grace, whatever skill, and whatever quiet endurance they could manage, inside a set of arrangements none of them had been given much power to question. Consider, one last time, the particular kind of attention this evening has asked of you. Not outrage, exactly, though outrage would be an understandable response to some of what you have heard. Something closer to the attention a careful historian gives an old photograph, turning it over to read the faint pencil notes on the back. Or the attention an archaeologist gives a fragment of broken pottery, patient enough to let the object explain itself rather than rushing to judge it by the standards of a different century entirely. Ellen Sharp and the thousands of women like her who spent their working lives in kitchens exactly like this one do not need to be pitied from a comfortable distance of 140 years. They need, more simply, to be seen once, clearly, in the full physical reality of what their days actually demanded of them, and then allowed to rest. That is the small, quiet purpose behind everything this account has tried to do tonight. Walking back down those worn stone stairs, past the ranges and the copper and the larder door, to stand for a while beside people the era never intended anyone to notice, and to give them, briefly and many years too late, one hurried attention their work always deserved. The candle has burned down now, in every sense this story has to offer. The table has been cleared. The fires are banked low, waiting for morning. Sleep well, and let the rest of it wait until then.